Europe is changing, and not in a slow, abstract academic way. Not in a way that only economists, politicians, or Brussels bureaucrats can measure. Europe is changing in the streets, in the schools, in the hospitals, in the housing queues, in the courtrooms, in the police reports, in the faces of parents who no longer feel comfortable letting their children walk alone, in areas where, 20 years ago, nobody would have thought twice. You can feel it when people lower their voices before saying what they really think. You can feel it when a father says, "This country is not what it used to be." You can feel it when a mother checks her phone again and again because her daughter is coming home late. You can feel it when ordinary working people, people who are not political, people who are not activists, people who just want to live a normal life, start asking questions they were told they were not allowed to ask. For years, Europeans were told the same things. The borders are under control. The asylum system is working. Mass migration will save the pensions. Integration is succeeding. Crime has nothing to do with migration. Anyone who questions the system is hateful, racist, backward, extreme. And now, after years of denial, the European Union itself is tightening migration rules. Stronger border procedures, faster asylum processes, tougher return systems, longer detention powers, more pressure to deport people with no right to stay, even talk of return hubs outside Europe. The language is bureaucratic, of course. They do not say, "We were wrong." They do not say, "Ordinary people were right." They do not say, "We ignored the warning signs until the political pressure became impossible to contain." No, they say migration management. They say solidarity mechanisms. They say screening procedures. They say return coordination. But behind all the soft language is a hard truth. Europe lost control, and now it is trying to claw it back. The question is whether it is already too late, because this is not only about immigration. It is about sovereignty. It is about trust. It is about safety. It is about whether European nations still have the right to decide who enters, who stays, who belongs, and who must leave. It is about whether citizenship means anything. It is about whether law means anything. It is about whether compassion has limits, whether borders have meaning, and whether governments exist to protect their own people or to manage their replacement as quietly as possible. And before anyone twists this, let me be clear. This is not an attack on every immigrant. This is not an attack on every foreigner. This is not an argument that every person who comes from outside Europe is bad, dangerous, or unwanted. That would be false, and it would be morally wrong. There are legal immigrants who work hard, obey the law, respect the country that received them, learn the language, raise decent families, and contribute more honestly than many native-born citizens ever do. A serious country can have legal immigration. A Christian society can protect genuine refugees. A humane civilization can show mercy. But mercy is not madness. Charity is not chaos. Compassion is not open borders. And Christianity is not national suicide. No country is required to accept unlimited numbers of people it cannot house, cannot integrate, cannot police, cannot educate, and cannot afford. No government has the moral right to sacrifice the safety of its own citizens to satisfy the emotional vanity of elites. No nation should be shamed for wanting to remain a nation. That is the line the political class tried to erase. They deliberately blurred every distinction. If you opposed illegal migration, they said you hated immigrants. If you wanted deportations enforced, they said you lacked compassion. If you wanted crime statistics, they said you were spreading hate. If you wanted integration to mean something real, they said you were attacking minorities. And for a long time, that strategy worked. People stayed silent. They complained privately, in kitchens, in taxis, in bars, in church car parks, in WhatsApp groups. But publicly, they stayed quiet because they had jobs to protect, families to feed, reputations to preserve. Nobody wanted to be destroyed over one honest sentence. But reality does not disappear just because politicians change the subject, or because the media chooses softer words, or because officials hide behind statistics and procedures. It slowly enters everyday life. First, people notice that finding a home has become harder. Then they notice the hospital waiting room is more crowded than before. Then they hear teachers talk quietly about classrooms where language barriers make everything more difficult. Then another police case appears in the news, and another courtroom story, and another grieving family stands in front of cameras asking why this was allowed to happen. And little by little, what used to be dismissed as paranoia becomes impossible to ignore. That is how official narratives collapse, not all at once, but gradually, under the pressure of ordinary people seeing the same pattern in different parts of their lives. Look at Brussels. In 2023, 2 Swedish football fans were murdered by a Tunisian man whose asylum claim had been rejected and who was living illegally in Belgium. That case should have been a turning point for the whole continent, not because it proves that every migrant is dangerous, it does not, but because it exposed something much more serious. The system knew he had no right to remain, and yet he remained. That is the scandal. Not only the crime itself, horrifying as it was, but the fact that a European state could say, in effect, this person should not be here, and then fail to make that decision real. A deportation order that does not lead to deportation is not law, it is theater. A border system that records illegal presence but does not remove it is not control, it is administration. A government that knows someone has no right to stay but allows him to remain until blood is spilled has failed in its most basic duty. Then Germany, Solingen, a festival, ordinary people, a knife attack, death, blood, panic, another national debate. The suspect, a Syrian man, had reportedly been subject to a failed transfer under European asylum rules. And why did that process fail? Because he was not where authorities expected him to be. Think about what that means. In one of the wealthiest, most technologically advanced countries in the world, a migration enforcement process can collapse because the person simply is not there when officials arrive. That is not serious statecraft. That is not border control. That is not public safety. That is a bureaucracy pretending to be a sovereign power. And when ordinary Germans watched that story unfold, many of them did not think, what a rare, isolated event. They thought, again. They thought, how many times? They thought, why does the system always seem to act after people are dead? Then Aschaffenburg, a knife attack in a park. 2 people dead, including a small child. The suspect was an Afghan asylum seeker. Again, the country was thrown into a debate about migration, asylum, deportation, and public safety. Again, politicians expressed shock. Again, people were told not to generalize. And yes, we should not generalize an entire population from one crime. That is true. But we are absolutely allowed to generalize about institutional failure when the same types of failures keep appearing. We are allowed to ask why dangerous people are not removed. We are allowed to ask why asylum systems are so easily abused. We are allowed to ask why the safety of citizens seems negotiable while the rights of offenders seem endless. We are allowed to ask why Europe can regulate bottle caps, carbon emissions, websites, bank accounts, and farmers with terrifying precision, but somehow cannot remove people who have no legal right to remain. Ireland has felt it too. For years, Ireland was treated as if it would somehow avoid the migration tensions visible in Britain, France, Germany, Sweden, Belgium, the Netherlands, Austria, and elsewhere. Ireland was supposed to be different, smaller, friendlier, more insulated. But then came the horror in Dublin, the attack around Parnell Square, where children were targeted and the country was shaken. The legal process must be respected. Accusations must be proven in court. But the public reaction told us something that cannot be ignored. Beneath the official surface, anger had already been building. And then, in Northern Ireland, Belfast saw its own explosion of fear and anger after a brutal knife attack. Riots followed, homes were attacked, cars burned, families were rescued. And of course, mob violence is wrong. Nobody serious should defend burning homes or targeting innocent people. That is not justice, that is lawlessness. But if the only thing politicians do is condemn the riot, without asking why the atmosphere became so combustible in the first place,
People do not lose trust
then they are
overnight.
not serious. They lose it when they feel ignored. They lose it when they believe their concerns are mocked. They lose it when they see authorities move faster to police public opinion than to police actual crime. They lose it when they are told, year after year, that their fears are imaginary, and then reality confirms those fears in the worst possible way. This is the real crisis in Europe, not just migration, but trust. And once trust dies, every incident becomes political dynamite. That is why Southport matters, even though it is not a case of illegal migration. The attacker was born in the United Kingdom. It was false to claim that he was an illegal migrant or a newly arrived asylum seeker. Those false claims spread quickly, and that is dangerous. But why did so many people believe them so fast? Because the public already distrusted the system. Because people had seen too many uncomfortable facts hidden, softened, delayed, buried, or wrapped in language designed to protect institutions from criticism. Because when authorities spend years telling citizens not to believe their own eyes, citizens eventually stop believing authorities. That is not healthy, but it is understandable. A state that wants public trust must be trustworthy. It must tell the truth, even when the truth is inconvenient. It must not treat citizens like children. It must not manipulate language. It must not hide behind euphemisms. It must not release information slowly, only when pressure becomes unbearable. The grooming gang scandals in the United Kingdom are perhaps the darkest example of this. For years, girls were abused, exploited, raped, trafficked, and abandoned by the very institutions that were supposed to protect them. Police failed, social services failed, local authorities failed, politicians failed, journalists failed. And one of the most disgusting parts of the story is that fear of discussing ethnicity, culture, and community tensions honestly helped paralyze the response. Girls were sacrificed to protect the image of the system. That sentence should haunt Britain forever. Because when children are being abused, the first concern of the state should not be community relations. It should not be optics. It should not be political correctness. It should not be whether the facts are useful to the wrong political side. The first concern should be rescuing the victims and punishing the offenders. Anything else is moral collapse. And this is why the public no longer accepts lectures from the same institutions that failed so badly. People are tired of being told that noticing patterns is hatred, while ignoring those patterns gets people hurt. Now, again, precision matters. Many of the grooming gang cases involved British citizens, not illegal migrants. Many were second generation or third generation. That means the issue is not only border control, it is also integration. It is also parallel societies. It is also the failure to assimilate people into the moral and legal order of the host country. And that problem may be even deeper. Because if someone comes illegally, the answer is simple: remove them. If someone comes legally and commits serious crimes, the answer should also be simple: deport them where legally possible. But when people are born in Europe, hold European citizenship, go through European schools, and still grow up alienated from the nation, hostile to its values, or embedded in communities where the law of the country feels weaker than the code of the group, then Europe is facing a civilizational integration crisis. That cannot be solved by slogans. For decades, Europe confused physical presence with integration. Living in a country is not the same as belonging to it. Having a passport is not the same as loyalty. Receiving welfare is not the same as assimilation. Going to school is not automatically integration. Integration means accepting the legal and moral order of the nation. It means respecting women. It means respecting freedom of speech. It means respecting Jews, Christians, atheists, and political opponents. It means obeying the law even when your family, clan, ideology, or religion tells you otherwise. It means understanding that Europe's freedoms were built over centuries and are not optional. And if a community produces significant numbers of people who reject those duties, then politicians must be allowed to say so. Not to demonize everyone in that community, not to punish innocent people, but to tell the truth. Because without
Now
truth,
let's talk about the
there
pension
can be
argument,
no reform.
because this is one of the great lies of our time.
The elite argument goes like this: Europe is aging. Europeans are not having enough children. Pension systems are unsustainable. Therefore, Europe needs mass immigration. At first glance, it sounds logical. And yes, the first part is true. Europe is aging. Birth rates are low. The old age dependency ratio is getting worse. There are fewer workers for every pensioner. The demographic crisis is real. But the solution they propose is not a solution. It is a delay mechanism. It is a Ponzi scheme with passports. If your pension system can only survive by importing workers, what happens when those workers age? You need another wave, then another, forever. And each new wave requires housing, schools, hospitals, welfare support, language training, policing, bureaucracy, and integration. If the migrants are high-skilled, legally admitted, culturally compatible, employed, and integrated, then they may help. Fine. Have that discussion honestly. But if the migration is large-scale, low-skilled, irregular, poorly integrated, or concentrated in communities that already suffer unemployment and social fragmentation, then it does not magically save the welfare state. It may increase pressure on it. You cannot solve the pension crisis by importing poverty. You cannot save public finances by creating permanent dependency. You cannot fix demographic decline by refusing to ask why Europeans themselves are not forming families. That is the question the ruling class avoids. Why are young Europeans not having children? Maybe because housing is unaffordable. Maybe because wages are too low. Maybe because taxes are too high. Maybe because stable family formation has been culturally undermined. Maybe because young men and women are drowning in economic insecurity. Maybe because societies that mock tradition, motherhood, fatherhood, Christianity, patriotism, and duty should not be surprised when people stop sacrificing for the future. If Europe wants children, it must become a place where family life is possible again. That means homes ordinary people can afford, work that pays, communities that are safe, schools that are orderly, tax systems that do not punish parents, a culture that honors marriage and children instead of treating them like lifestyle accessories. But that is hard. That requires reform. That requires courage. That requires challenging corporations, banks, landlords, bureaucracies, and cultural institutions. So instead, politicians import workers and call it compassion. But let's be honest, much of mass migration policy is not compassion. It is cheap labor policy wearing a humanitarian mask. The pressure created by mass migration does not fall evenly across society. It does not fall hardest on the people giving speeches in parliament or writing columns about tolerance from wealthy neighborhoods. It falls on the worker whose wages are weakened by endless labor supply. It falls on the young couple competing for a flat they can barely afford. It falls on the pensioner waiting longer for medical care. It falls on the teacher expected to manage a classroom where half the children need language support. It falls on the police officer dealing with social tensions that politicians refuse to name. The wealthy liberal experiences migration as cuisine, moral status, and cheap services. Ordinary people experience it as pressure. And then those ordinary people are told they are selfish for objecting. This is why the anger is so deep. It is not only fear, it is humiliation. People feel they have been replaced in the moral imagination of their own leaders. The migrant is discussed with compassion. The asylum seeker is discussed with compassion. The foreign criminal is often discussed with complexity. But the native citizen is discussed with suspicion. If he complains, he is xenophobic. If she is afraid, she is manipulated by the far right. If they want their town to remain recognizable, they are nostalgic bigots. This is backwards. The first duty of a government is to its own citizens. That does not mean cruelty to outsiders. It means ordered responsibility. It means that before a state makes promises to the world, it must keep its promises to its own people. That is not extremism.
The who will
That
do
is
the jobs
basic
argument is
political
another
morality.
insult disguised as wisdom. Who will work in care homes? Who will clean hotels? Who will pick crops? Who will drive taxis? Who will work in construction? This argument assumes Europeans cannot or will not work. It assumes the only way to keep society functioning is to import a permanent low-wage class from poor countries. But Europeans built the modern world. Europeans built railways, cathedrals, ports, farms, factories, laboratories, hospitals, armies, universities, and entire nations from ruins after war. Europeans are not allergic to work, but work must pay, housing must be affordable, family life must be possible. A man must be able to work, marry, have children, and live with dignity. A woman must be able to raise children without being economically punished. Young people must be trained, not discarded. Wages must rise when labor is scarce, not be suppressed by importing more workers. Labor shortages are not always a crisis. Sometimes they are a signal. They tell employers to pay more. They tell governments to train people. They tell societies to value essential work. Mass immigration often short-circuits that process. Instead of raising wages, import labor. Instead of training citizens, import labor. Instead of fixing family policy, import labor. Instead of reforming pensions, import labor. Instead of asking why young Europeans feel hopeless, import labor. That is not a national strategy. That is an escape route for cowards. And beneath all of this is a spiritual problem. Europe has forgotten that it is a civilization, not a marketplace. A nation is not just GDP. It is not just a tax base. It is not just consumers and workers and pensioners. A nation is memory. It is language. It is law. It is churches, graves, farms, towns, songs, stories, festivals, family names, moral habits, and shared assumptions so deep that people rarely notice them until they disappear. When those shared assumptions disappear, no amount of economic growth can replace them. Trust is the hidden wealth of a nation. Trust lets children play outside. Trust lets old people walk alone. Trust lets women feel safe. Trust lets neighbors help each other. Trust lets police do their job. Trust lets courts function. Trust lets welfare systems survive because people believe they are contributing to a common good, not being exploited by a system that no longer feels like theirs. Mass migration, especially when rapid and poorly controlled, can damage that trust. Not because foreigners are automatically bad, but because trust requires shared norms, shared loyalty, shared law, and a sense that the nation is not being transformed without consent. Consent is the key word. Europeans were never honestly asked if they wanted this scale of change. They were managed into it. They were lectured into it. They were shamed into it. And when they voted against it, parties often formed coalitions to avoid giving them what they voted for. That is not democracy working well. That is democracy being contained. And the more people feel contained, the more explosive politics becomes. This is why the new EU migration rules are both important and insufficient. Yes, stronger return rules are necessary. Yes, detention powers may be necessary for people who are likely to abscond. Yes, return hubs may be necessary if Europe is serious about removing those with no right to stay. Yes, a rejected asylum claim must have consequences. Yes, foreign criminals must be removed whenever possible. But Europe's problem has never been only lack of laws. It has been lack of will. Will Germany enforce the law after Solingen and Aschaffenburg? Will Belgium remove people before another Brussels? Will Ireland regain control before public anger becomes uglier? Will Britain confront grooming gang failures without hiding behind euphemisms? Will France, Spain, Italy, Sweden, Austria, the Netherlands, and the rest of Europe choose their citizens over ideology?
Order must mean
That
return.
is the test.
A deportation decision must end with removal. A border screening process must not become a waiting room for disappearance. A foreign criminal should not be able to stay because paperwork is difficult.
A country that refuses to take back its nationals should face pressure through visas, trade, aid, and diplomacy. No more excuses. No more lessons will be learned. No more candlelit speeches after preventable tragedies. How many lessons does Europe need to learn before it acts? And let us be clear about safety. Safety is not a luxury. Safety is civilization. It is the quiet confidence of a mother letting her daughter take the bus without fear. It is a child walking to school without the parents checking the news every 5 minutes. It is a pensioner going to church without avoiding certain streets. It is a young woman walking home without planning an escape route in her head. It is families attending festivals without scanning the crowd. It is the basic belief that police protect citizens and criminals face consequences. When safety disappears, everything else becomes fragile. Freedom becomes fragile. Community becomes fragile. Democracy becomes fragile. Because people who feel unsafe will eventually vote for whoever promises order. And if moderate leaders refuse to provide order, more radical leaders will. That is not a threat. It is a political law. The establishment created this situation by refusing to listen. For decades, anyone who raised concerns was smeared. Anyone who asked about borders was mocked. Anyone who questioned asylum abuse was demonized. Anyone who wanted crime data was accused of hatred. The result is that many people no longer believe mainstream institutions are capable of reform. They may be wrong in some cases. They may exaggerate. They may fall for false stories. They may become angry in ways that are unfair to innocent people. But the responsibility for this distrust lies heavily with the people who made honest discussion impossible. When truth is banned, rumor replaces it. When debate is censored, resentment grows. When institutions lie, conspiracy thrives. So if Europe wants stability, it must start telling the truth. The truth is that illegal migration is an attack on sovereignty. Failed deportations can be deadly. Some asylum systems have been abused. Integration has failed in many places. Some second- and third-generation communities are alienated from the nations they live in. Public services are under pressure. Housing is limited. Europe cannot take everyone. Compassion without limits becomes destruction. And the truth is that ordinary Europeans were right to be concerned. That is what the elites cannot forgive. Ordinary people were right. They may not have had academic language. They may not have had reports, charts, or policy papers. But they understood something basic. They understood that borders matter, that integration cannot be assumed, that housing is not infinite, that crime cannot be discussed honestly if everyone is afraid of the facts, and that using pensions as an excuse for permanent demographic transformation was never a serious long-term plan. They saw it before the politicians admitted it. They felt it before the institutions measured it. And now, after years of being mocked, the direction of European policy is proving that their concerns were not imaginary. Now the challenge is to turn that anger into reform, not chaos. Because mob violence is not the answer. Burning homes is not the answer. Attacking innocent people is not the answer. Collective punishment is not the answer. A Christian civilization cannot defend itself by becoming unjust. The answer is lawful firmness. Borders enforced. Asylum restricted to genuine refugees. Illegal entrants removed. Foreign serious criminals deported. Citizens protected. Crime data published honestly. Integration standards enforced. Family policy rebuilt. Workers trained. Wages allowed to rise. Housing built for citizens. Public services restored. National identity defended. Christian moral confidence recovered. That is not extremism.
And yes,
That is the minimum
people
required
abroad.
for survival.
But help does not always mean relocation. Sometimes the best help is aid near conflict zones. Sometimes it is regional protection. Sometimes it is trade policy. Sometimes it is stabilization. Sometimes it is saying clearly that Europe cannot be the emergency housing system of the entire world.
A lifeboat that takes everyone sinks, and when it sinks, nobody is saved. This is the part sentimental politicians refuse to understand. Limits are not cruelty. Limits are what make compassion possible. A family with a budget understands limits. A church charity understands limits. A hospital understands limits. A nation must understand limits too. Europe is full of people who need help already. Elderly people alone, young families priced out, workers taxed heavily, children in failing schools, farmers crushed by regulation, small businesses drowning, homeless citizens ignored, veterans forgotten, pensioners choosing between heating and food. And yet, the political class always seems to find more moral energy for people arriving from outside than for the citizens who built the system in the first place. That has to end. A government must love its own people first. Again, that does not mean hating others. It means knowing your duty. A father does not hate other children because he feeds his own first. A nation does not hate foreigners because it protects its own citizens first. A Christian does not abandon justice because he believes in mercy. Europe needs that moral order again, because right now, the moral order is inverted. The law-abiding citizen is expected to be endlessly patient. The taxpayer is expected to pay. The victim is expected to remain dignified. The local community is expected to adapt. The native worker is expected to compete. The young family is expected to accept higher rents. The police officer is expected to manage chaos. The teacher is expected to integrate the world. And the politician gives speeches about tolerance from a secure neighborhood. No. Enough. The patience of Europe is not infinite. The new migration rules prove that the old consensus is breaking, but rules on paper will not save Europe unless there is courage behind them. Courage to deport, courage to say no, courage to close loopholes, courage to defy activist pressure, courage to protect girls before reputations, courage to publish facts, courage to rebuild national confidence, and courage to say that Europe is worth preserving. That may be the most important thing. For too long, Europeans have been taught to feel guilty for existing, guilty for their history, guilty for their borders, guilty for their prosperity, guilty for their churches, guilty for their nations, guilty for wanting continuity, guilty for wanting their grandchildren to inherit a recognizable home. A civilization that hates itself cannot survive, and it certainly cannot integrate anyone. Why would newcomers respect a civilization whose own leaders constantly apologize for it? Why would young people defend a nation their teachers describe only as oppressive? Why would anyone assimilate into a culture that refuses to defend its own value? Europe must recover confidence. Not arrogance, not hatred. Confidence. Confidence in its laws, its history, its Christian inheritance, its freedoms, its duties, its borders, its people. A confident Europe can be generous, because generosity without self-destruction is possible. A weak Europe is not generous, it is merely surrendering. And that is what so much of the last decades has felt like. Surrender disguised as virtue. Surrender of borders. Surrender of language. Surrender of law. Surrender of public safety. Surrender of honest debate. Surrender of the working class. Surrender of the young. Surrender of the future.
Europe is not doomed.
But surrender
Europe can still choose life. It can choose families over demographic decline. It can choose work over dependency. It can choose borders over chaos. It can choose truth over censorship. It can choose citizens over ideological experiments. It can choose Christianity over nihilism. It can choose order over fear. But it must choose soon, because every year of delay makes the problem harder. Every failed deportation teaches illegal migrants the system is weak. Every hidden statistic deepens distrust. Every preventable crime radicalizes more people. Every insult thrown at concerned citizens pushes them further away from mainstream politics. Every housing shortage, every school crisis, every overwhelmed hospital, every violent case, every grooming scandal, every bureaucratic excuse becomes another crack in the old order. And one day, systems that look stable suddenly break.
The warning signs were not hidden. They were visible across the continent, from Brussels to Solingen, from Aschaffenburg to Dublin, from Belfast to the British grooming gang scandals. They were visible in the panic after Southport, in the pension numbers, in the failed return rates, and in the rise of anti-immigration parties that the establishment still pretends not to understand. Above all, they were visible in the quiet conversations of ordinary citizens who kept saying, year after year, "This cannot continue," while their leaders told them to lower their voices. Now that whisper is becoming a shout, and Europe had better listen, because this debate will not disappear. Calling people names will not make it disappear. Censoring speech will not make it disappear. Passing weak reforms without enforcement will not make it disappear. Telling citizens to be more tolerant while their lived reality gets worse will not make it disappear. Reality always wins. Reality wins in budgets. Reality wins in demographics. Reality wins in crime. Reality wins in elections. Reality wins in the streets. The only question is whether Europe faces reality through democratic reform, lawful enforcement, and moral courage, or whether it waits until anger becomes uncontrollable. I want reform. I want law. I want order. I want Europe to defend itself without losing its soul. That means rejecting hatred, but also rejecting weakness. It means protecting innocent migrants from mob violence, but also protecting European citizens from criminality and disorder. It means speaking truthfully without dehumanizing anyone. It means remembering that justice and mercy must stand together because either one without the other becomes monstrous. But justice must return. Borders must return. Consequences must return. Citizenship must mean something again. And leaders must finally understand that their own people are not the enemy. The enemy is chaos. The enemy is cowardice. The enemy is the ideology that says a nation has no right to survive. The enemy is the lie that Europe can absorb the world without becoming something else. Europe does not need to hate anyone to say no. Europe does not need to be cruel to enforce the law. Europe does not need to abandon compassion to defend its borders. Europe simply needs to remember that a civilization that refuses to protect itself will not be admired for its kindness. It will be buried by its weakness. And if Europe's current leaders cannot understand that, then European voters will eventually find leaders who do. They will find them because fear demands an answer, because anger demands an answer, because grief demands an answer, because demographic collapse demands an answer, because the pension crisis demands an answer, because mothers and fathers demand an answer, because the dead cannot speak, but the living still can, and the living are beginning to speak very loudly. The old era is ending. The era of open denial is ending. The era of calling everyone racist is ending. The era of pretending deportation orders are enough is ending. The era of sacrificing truth for comfort is ending. Now Europe must decide what comes next. A serious future built on borders, law, family, work, faith, and national confidence. Or a broken future managed by bureaucrats, policed by slogans, and interrupted by tragedies everyone claims they could not have predicted. But they were predicted by ordinary people for years. And they were right.